One way that you might be able to think about what the government is and isn't allowed to do is to actually think about our property rights. What makes something ours, and what are we allowed to do with the things that are ours? The 20th century philosopher Robert Nozick thought that if we could answer those questions, we could actually come up with a theory of what the just society would look like. Nozick was a libertarian, which meant a couple things. Number one, it meant that we should have maximum liberty, we should have maximum freedom to do what we want with our bodies. Number two, it meant that the way that we acquired property was by adding our labor to things or freely transferring things that we already own. Nozick brought this out in two different rules, two different principles of justice for property. The first is called the principle of justice in acquisition, and it tells us how we actually got property. Basically, we would go out into the state of nature where things are unowned, we would find something that is unowned, and we would add our labor to it. For example, I might go out into the woods, I might find a stick that's fallen down, I might carve it into a walking stick, and now I own the walking stick. The second principle that Nozick talks about is the principle of justice in transfer, and this has to do with how we actually transfer property from one person to another. Basically, if we own something that has been legitimately acquired, then we are able to freely transfer it to anyone we want for any reason that we want. I might take my walking stick and I might want to give it to you as a gift for your birthday or for Christmas or for something like that. On the other hand, it might be the case that you have something that I want, for example, money, and we might freely come to an arrangement where you give me money and I give you the walking stick, and we have transferred property among each other. Now, very importantly, Nozick thinks that, number one, these are the only ways in which you can actually acquire property. You can either go out in the world and add your labor to something that's unowned, or you can transfer it freely if you have already legitimately acquired it. Number two, he thinks that if these are the only ways that you can actually acquire property, anything else is theft, which means no one else can tell you what to do with your property. No one can force you to transfer your property if you don't want to. It turns out if these are the only ways that you can transfer property, that has some very serious implications for what the government can and can't do. And Nozick thinks that what we're ultimately going to wind up with is something that he calls the minimal state. The minimal state is basically a state that can only do two things. It can protect your right to life, and it can protect your property rights. It can either prevent people from taking things that are yours, or if someone actually does manage to take something that's yours, they can go and they can get it back for you. What would a minimal state look like? Well, in practice, it would look very different from, for example, the American government that exists today. We wouldn't have a Department of the Interior. We wouldn't have a Food and Drug Administration. We wouldn't have a Department of Education. We wouldn't have publicly funded roads, because none of those things either preserve our right to life or preserve our property rights. Instead, we might still have an army to prevent other countries from coming in and either killing us or stealing our stuff. We would probably also have a criminal justice system, because not only do we want to prevent people from killing us or taking our stuff, we need some kind of mechanism to actually get our stuff back if someone comes and takes it. If you think about it in a certain respect, this is actually a really appealing and straightforward form of government. It very clearly lays out what the state can do. It can preserve our right to life. It can preserve our property rights. It can go and get stuff back that has been taken from us. And it very clearly tells us what the government can't do. Literally anything else, because literally anything else will involve taxes, and taxes are, in Nozick's view, theft. They are the government requiring us to pay money whether or not we actually want to do it, and that is not freely transferring our money. That is not freely transferring our property. Now, if it's really appealing like that, why don't we just live in a libertarian paradise? It turns out that libertarianism actually faces one very, very serious challenge, and it has to do with this idea that it can in fact be the government's job to go and get stuff that has been stolen from us. So if you think about the principle of justice in transfer, it says that we are able to freely transfer property that has been legitimately acquired. And it turns out that both parts of that principle are very important. Number one, we have to freely transfer things. And number two, we are only allowed to transfer things that have been legitimately acquired. Now, Take one example from American history and you can see just how sticky this can get and how quickly it can get sticky. Take slavery in the United States, for example. Now, the fruits of slavery from the United States are very clearly a violation of the principle of justice in transfer, because everyone who was enslaved had all of their work and all of their property taken from them without their consent. It was not a free transfer. And that means that whoever took that stuff, white Southern slave owners, for example, they acquired all of that property illegitimately. Now, what someone like Nozick would say is it should be the government's job to go in and set that circumstance right. The government should be able to take back the fruits of enslaved persons' labor, return it to them, make sure that enslaved persons are freed so that they are able to pursue their own goals and pursue their own property. But obviously that's not what happened. Instead, what happened is white Southern slave owners took the property that they unjustly acquired and used that property to acquire more property, and then used that property to acquire more property. And their descendants did that, and their descendants did that, so on and so forth, until the present day. By the same token, you have enslaved persons who did not have their property returned to them, and they were worse off as a result. And so their descendants were worse off as a result, and their descendants were worse off as a result. And in theory, what someone like Nozick ought to be able to say is, today we look back and we recognize that evil, we recognize that injustice. And so what the government should do is the government should simply figure out what exactly the fruits of theft from enslaved persons were, write up a bill, and transfer that money back to the descendants of enslaved persons. But you can see really quickly how this is super, super complicated, because we don't have good records of who all the descendants of enslaved persons were, or what precisely the level of labor and property that was taken from each individual enslaved person was, or how the white Southern slave owners were able to use their ill-gotten gains to create wealth, and how much of that wealth was the result of legitimate business activity, and how much of that was the result of slavery. And now you have this incredibly tangled up mess that probably you will never actually be able to sort out. And if you can't actually sort out that mess, it's not totally clear how libertarianism is going to be able to help you figure out what the property rights actually are. And this is where the problem comes in. If you're going to have a political philosophy that is going to tell you how society should actually operate, you shouldn't have a political philosophy that looks at our current situation and tells you we literally practically can't figure out how to solve what we recognize is a very serious problem. Because it's not just the results of slavery. There are the results of any number of individual and systemic injustices over the course of human history that have influenced what I own and what you own and what everyone else owns. And for libertarianism to work, we either have to be able to say, we're going to press pause, we're going to completely start over from scratch, which is frankly impossible, or we're going to have to be able to say we can actually sort out how to fix all of these past injustices, which seems really impractical. In fact, it's this concern that led Robert Nozick, a famous libertarian philosopher, to actually abandon libertarianism late in his life. He thought that if libertarianism was going to be successful, you would have to be able to solve this question, and he thought you wouldn't actually be able to do so. Was Nozick right? Is it actually the case that libertarianism should be abandoned and that it's not a reasonable political philosophy? Well, maybe not. There are plenty of libertarian philosophers who are trying to figure out ways that we could, in fact, solve these problems. But if you're going to be a libertarian philosopher, these are questions you're going to have to answer.